Before we get started today, I wanted to tell you about something that I'm actually going to be doing. On Friday, July 14th, I'll be the MC for Raise the Bar's biggest event of the year, Under Review. Raise the Bar is the foundation of Anthony Barr, the NFL linebacker. That's going to be held at US Bank Stadium in Minneapolis. Tickets include Vikings field and locker room access, meet and greet with Vikings cheerleaders, an auction, silent auction. All amazing stuff they got going on there. All events will fund scholarships for single mothers, helping them as they pursue their degrees and raise families. For tickets, go to raisethebar.org. I've got that link for you in the show notes. Welcome to Challenge the Norm. My name is Norman Seawright. Thank you for joining us. Thanks for listening anywhere you get your podcasts. Rate, review, leave all these notes because this is still an experimental process and I can use all the input I can get to make this ride fun for me and fun for you. On today's show, I got a friend joining me here, Jake Griffith. He is the play-by-play announcer for Minnesota Aurora FC and he appears on Minnesota News Network. But first, check this out. Fun fact. Ever wonder why you have your best ideas in the shower? It's because you're high. Taking a warm shower feels good. It releases the chemical dopamine in the brain. And that chemical is responsible for making you feel good. And once you feel good, you're distracted, you're relaxed. That's when you have your best ideas. Okay, so today, I've got my buddy Jake Griffith here with me. He and I go all the way back to our days in West Virginia. So as I know him, he's worked in college athletics at Marshall University while I was out there working in Charleston, West Virginia, although back and forth between there and Huntington. As of right now, he is working with the Minnesota News Network and as the play-by-play commentator for Minnesota Aurora FC. Jake, buddy, how are you?
I'm good. I'm feeling good. We just wrapped up our season over at Aurora and Egan. I'm gonna miss it. It's gonna be weird not having Minnesota Aurora soccer to cover. But it's been a fantastic summer. I kind of hit the ground running since I got up here just 2.5 months ago?
Yeah, so getting into Minnesota, I think, you and I talk about this quite a lot. Like the experience, I mean, you're drinking Caribou coffee right now, your first experience with this. How you liking this?
I have quickly become a Minnesotan. Within 2.5 months, I have gotten my car titled here. I have a Minnesota driver's license. I have Minnesota gear, and now I'm drinking Caribou coffee, which you told me is headquartered out of Minnesota. I'm normally a Starbucks guy. I buy that Starbucks like pre-jugged coffee and make it every morning. It's pretty good. You and I are like-minded. We like the nitro cold brew coffee, and as soon as I saw they had that, I was like, I think it's probably time for me to try this. So
yes. It's
pretty good. I gotta admit, pretty good.
Yeah, see, that kept me like going a lot through my my days in West Virginia, my second job, where you go to your drive-through and you're like, let me get your nitro brewed coffee as much as you'll give me, and they're like, we can only give you but so much because it is so much caffeine that it might stop your heart.
Yeah. It always bothered me because I would be like, what's the biggest size? Oh, we can only do grande. But I could order multiple grandes of the nitro. So you can't order it in a bigger size, but you can order different, a bunch of the same size. I'm like, okay, this makes sense. So
risk management takes very many forms. So we're talking today. We're going to start with Minnesota Aurora FC. I think as you and I talk about them, and I've seen them through their first few seasons, and you've been directly with them in this season. And I've said this publicly, they're in a division that just absolutely cannot handle them. Mm-hmm. But as they progressed through their year and got into the playoffs and performed the way they did, like what did you notice about their development as a squad and the things that they're accomplishing and then ultimately, like, where do they go from here?
I think in terms of looking at the season as a whole, in terms of accomplishments, people are going to say, well, you didn't get back to the final, which they were finalists last year. I think the casual observer is going to say immediately that's a failure, right? But I don't think it is. I think this year's team, and like we talked about before we started recording, on paper only means so much. But this year's team, I think, knocked down a lot more hurdles, if that's even possible. I mean, getting through your first year is a huge hurdle in and of itself. But I think this year's team is better than last year's team, both in roster construction and the way they played. I just think they came up short in the end, and there are several factors that went into that. Obviously, they were shorthanded going into Michigan. I do think that people they're not going to take this part into account, but, playing a neutral site playoff in Michigan, a place that you haven't been all season, and they were 30 fans in attendance. As you and I both know, last year they were averaging 5,500, 6,000. This year they had 3 matches that they sold out, over 7,000 close to people. That's a different, it's almost like the COVID times in sports where you were so used to playing in these packed stadiums, and then you had to get used to playing in front of nobody. And there is an adjustment there. There is, that sort of does change the game, so to speak. And so you go to Michigan, and although, I talked to Nicole Lukic, their head coach, once a week before every broadcast. And one of the questions I posed to her once it was confirmed that Flint City AFC was going to host that portion of the playoffs, hey, how does what are the vibes around the team, in regard to that? How are they feeling? And she said, well, we're bummed, but I think we've put it behind us. I think our mentality is in a good spot. And you can say that. And I truly think she believed that. And I truly think that the players initially were, it's whatever. But it's a different beast when you actually get out there and you play. And they grinded through a grueling 12-match regular season sprint. They won the division going away. The next closest team was 10-plus points shy of them, and that was Chicago City. You do that in hopes that you can host the playoffs and play in front of your fans. And when you kind of have that rug pulled out from underneath you, you do get bummed. That is a hard hurdle to overcome. And I think that you saw the wear and tear on them, or not the wear and tear, I guess, but the disappointment a little bit in that first round matchup against Chicago, because you're playing a team that you just shellacked literally less than a week ago, 5-0. And who you beat earlier in the season and should have beat worse than 3-1, and you beat them at their place. And you draw them again, so it's kind of a, hey, how do we stay focused on this and not overlook them? Because we obviously know we've outscored them 8-1 across 180 minutes of soccer. You've got to, how do you not overlook that team and look forward to the next match? And then you're also playing in front of pretty much nobody. The only fans that were there for the Minnesota-Chicago game were the small contingent of Aurora fans that were able to travel. And I think that speaks to how diehard the fan base is. That there were 30, 40 people that were willing to get in separate cars and drive 10 hours from, Eagan or Minneapolis or wherever they're living in the Twin Cities and go out to Michigan. But so I just think there were a couple factors. And then, like I mentioned, you're shorthanded. Hannah Adler gets called up to the United States, national team, beach national team. Yep. Unfortunate timing of there. You had some players that, were carrying a knock going into it. And I know every team is dealing with that, but one of those players being Sophie French, who didn't play in the first match, she was a big catalyst for the team this year. And Adler was the second leading scorer on the team this year. So I think there were a lot of things that went into that. And then you talked about the division. I think the division this year was slightly maybe worse than it was last year because of, and it's not anybody's fault per se, but the division, they lose St. Louis, which was kind of regarded as the dead weight of the division last year. But in St. Louis's place, you add 3 expansion teams that have never played at this level before. And so that being Bavarian United, you had, I'm drawing a blank on the other 2. I can't believe this.
Additions?
Yeah, 2
Rochester.
other. You're right. Rochester FC and RKC Third Coast. Thank you. I knew it was 2 Wisconsin teams. But so you have 3 newcomers to the division. And one of those teams, you look at RKC, Minnesota beat them 10-0 at home and 8-1 at their place. Really, Bavarian probably gave Minnesota the 2 most competitive matches they've had because they had the competitive scoreline at Bavarian. And then Bavarian scored first on Minnesota when they played here. And then Aurora responded with 5 consecutive goals.
And I look at the nature of what this is, or how competitive this team is, how competitive their games are, how talented they are. I told you about this. I spoke with Maya Hansen this year, and she's like, oh, no, I was like, you seem to have found another motor. She's like, oh, I did. She's like, I took it a little bit more seriously this year, which I think is a common thought process with a lot of the players who were like, yeah, this is a pretty professional thing we're doing. This is going to be fun. We're good at this. So we're going to come in here and do the thing, do what we know how to do. And then they go to the final. They are defeated 1-0 in the final. They come back. They're like, no, we're going to kick everyone's heads in. And you can see the difference in the product on the field, where they're all much more dialed in. Their conditioning's better. They're sharper with basically everything.
Oh, yeah.
And I guess the way I think about this is, like, I would not say anything around, like, manage expectations. I feel that is going a bit too far. But when we're looking at like something like this, like, at the end of the day, I think when we talk about the level of play, when we talk about the division and who's where and just the resource allocation with all of the teams, I mean, you have the range of it everywhere. I don't know that I don't believe there is any other team in this league that has the structure and the type of investment that Aurora has. I mean, others have like huge investments for sure, as you know, attached to other USL sides. But for what this is, it's unique.
Yeah.
And like, where do they find that consistent competition is probably the question I'm trying to ask.
Absolutely, and I think that's the question on everybody's mind, because you go through now 2 regular seasons where you don't lose. I mean, the only time that they've lost in their franchise's history is in the playoffs. I think the only team comparable to them would be Indy 11, who just beat them. And Indy 11, based on my just very rough stat keeping that I do for broadcasting, Minnesota's the winningest all-time team in USLW League history. Indy 11's right there behind them. I mean, Indy 11 earlier this year lost to St. Charles FC. That was their first regular season loss ever. So they went undefeated last year and lost to Aurora in the quarterfinal round. But I think, and I had this conversation with some people out in Michigan, I think that to put it into perspective, just how impressive it is what Aurora's doing, it's not even that they're community owned. The USLW League teams that are all successful, you mentioned it, they're all connected to existing USL 2, 1 championship franchises on the men's side. Indy 11, Oakland Soul, which is connected to the Oakland Roots of the USL championship. All those teams, they have that existing infrastructure in place that when the W League formed in 2022, they just said, okay, we're going to add this channel, but it does make that transition easier because you have knowledgeable people in your house, in your building, that know how to run a team at the top flight level. Whereas Minnesota, they're not connected to any. I mean, they're not connected to the Loons. There's not a USL championship team in the state of Minnesota. There's not, and so they're kind of doing this, getting it out the mud, so to speak, on their own. And so for them to come out here and their inaugural season raise as much money as they did, that continue over to this year, then be undefeated, then attract the type of players that they've been able to get. I think even though they don't have a USLW championship to show for it, that doesn't mean that they haven't been a successful franchise by any means. I mean, Tormenta won it all last year, and they didn't even make the playoffs this year. And they're connected to Tormenta South Georgia FC, who... I mean, I know from Jamil Roberts, right? I mean, he went straight to there from college and had a little successful run, and now he's over in Australia doing his thing. And so I do think it does put it into perspective that Minnesota is kind of existing as a freestanding, standalone club on their own, trying to navigate this, and they don't really have, like I mentioned, an existing USL structure that can say, all right, here's the next step. Here's the next step. I mean, I think, and this is just me, I don't have any inside information on this. This is just me saying this. I think the logical next step is obviously try to go to the NWSL.
Oh, for sure.
I mean, it has to be. And I know that there might be some people that say, well, what about the Super League? What about the USL Super League, which is the competitor, so to speak, from the USL to the NWSL. But I think it makes more sense for Aurora to make the jump to the NWSL because it's already an established league. They have an established television contract, a structure, a playoff format, a commissioner, all these things. I think if you make the jump to the Super League, even though you're already in the USL pyramid, I think it's just going to be that much more difficult because the Super League is going to go through what Minnesota's already gone through of, hey, we got to feel this out. We got to figure out how this is going to work. And there's no guarantees that the Super League, and no, I mean, this is no disrespect to the, Amanda Vandevoort, the president of the Super League. I think she's fantastic. I think that what the USL has done is fantastic. But there's no guarantees that that's going to work. I mean, you're going on, I know you have existing, not top flight, but existing, professional structures in the USL, but we've never had a direct competitor to the NWSL in the American domestic soccer format. The question becomes, is American domestic soccer strong enough to support two top flight women's leagues that are competing with each other? I don't have the answer to that. People that get paid more than I do and are smarter than I am and have been working in soccer, I'm not even sure they have the answer to that. So I think if Aurora were to say, hey, Jake, what are your thoughts on this? Which they haven't, and they probably won't because I'm just the guy that talks on TV about it. But I think my answer would be, the logical next step would be, hey, NWSL. Now, that's obviously a significant financial commitment. I think it's, if I'm not mistaken, I think it's $50 million entry fee into the NWSL.
Well, the good news is you have quite a few corporations right here in state who absolutely could bankroll this thing. And when I was looking at, so as far as, and I'm sidestepping here, as far as detractors go, I didn't ever hear very many of them, but the very specific things they had to say, like, well, why should we care about this? And my answer was right away, like, you have to understand the cultural touch point on this. Like, it's not that it is a moment in time with women's athletics. Like, women's athletics have been here to stay. They have been fantastic. The U.S. women's national team is typically expected to destroy everyone at all times. Now, how do you create a legitimate farm system that supports that and sustains that? I mean, you're looking up right now, like, Trinity Rodman's out here, like, I would like to make my own name here and do my own thing. You have Megan Rapinoe, like, hey, so this is my last dance,
right?
Which, side note, hey, if Aurora needs to scrimmage somebody, call her and be like, why don't you bring your squad up here and let's play? Or
honestly, pull a Heather O'Reilly, like what they did at NC Courage. I mean, they brought her on as a coach and a player. Heather O'Reilly suited up in the playoff game the other day for NC Courage U23. She was in the starting 11. Now, does she play all 90 minutes? No. You can't expect a 39-year-old, twice retired, former professional soccer player to play all 90. But what did it do? That was what everyone wanted to talk about for probably upwards of a month during the USLW regular season. I mean, if nothing else, it's all about, it's about performing on the field. But it's also, and you know this, it's about what you can do to stay within the cultural, zeitgeist, right? Like, stay in the cultural conversation. And that thrust NC Courage U23s into well, hold on a minute. We got to pay attention to this, this pre-professional USLW league team. That these are collegiate players. Why? Because one of the GOATs is on their roster now. I mean, honestly, that's something that a team like Minnesota Aurora, maybe not a bad thing to say, hey, Rapinoe, when you're done playing, would you be interested in just kicking around on our team and, hanging out for a little bit?
You know how angry people would get at that?
Oh, I know. The rich get richer, right? I mean, like, it's the rich get richer. But, I think you brought up something interesting about how do you develop a legitimate farm system on the women's side that's comparable to what the men have. And I do think that does give the USLW League a leg up because the way, and I'm not sure a whole lot of people understand the whole pyramid structure of the USL. So the United Soccer League is the largest organized soccer structure in America domestically. You have an academy. It's very similar to what we see over in Europe. You have an academy, you have an amateur, a pre-professional, and a professional on the men's side. And they're trying to carve that out on the women's side as well. That's why they have the USLW League. They have an academy. So right now it's on the women's side, USL Academy, USLW League, and eventually W League theoretically would feed into the Super League on the women's side. And so I do think that gives the USL a leg up because you started the right way. I've always felt like the MLS they've done it backwards. So they had the MLS, and then now they're developing the next pro level. And so they're trying to carve out that farm system a little bit on the MLS side, and they're in season 2 of Next Pro. But I like the way the Super League, or at least the USLW, has done things, because instead of starting with, hey, we're going to start first with the professional team and then figure out the rest of the way, you start small and then you go bigger and bigger and bigger. And so I do think that there's pros and cons, right? I guess is what I'm trying to say. On the one hand, the NWSL has the leg up because they have the Paramount CBS TV deal and the established teams and the big markets, and it's known. When you say professional domestic women's soccer, your mind immediately goes to the NWSL.
Right.
On the other side, there is no feeder league into the NWSL. So there's not, as it exists right now, there's not other options for women to play soccer professionally. Your options are go college and then hope you perform well enough and get drafted into the NWSL. And if you don't, well, your career is maybe over, or you can go overseas, or you can play in the W League until you can carve something out and then move on. And so I think at the end of the day, more options for women to play professional soccer in America is never a bad thing. I know that there was some hand-wringing on social media about can America support 2 professional domestic women's soccer leagues? I mean, I think the answer is yes, to a degree. I mean, it's never a bad thing to give people more options.
No, I mean, and as long as you know what you're expecting out of them, like you're not. I always get a little, iffy with all of this because we then butt up against what is the other elephant in the room, which is the capital part of it, right? Like you want everything you do to be profitable in some way, right? Which is, reasons why, they'll tell us WNBA players don't get paid as much because their TV contract, like stuff like that. And it is the one, I would say, major issue I might have with American sports, like in general. In some ways it can work to an advantage, but in a lot of ways, like if your whole thing's profit driven structure, like you're not. And if it's like ruthlessly so, you're really not going to be, commanding the types of talent, the types of product that you're getting in the Premier League.
Yeah, absolutely.
Things of that nature.
Well, and and I listen, money makes the world go round.
Yes.
Right? I get it. But I do think one of the worst things that ever happened to sports at all levels is that it became hyper money driven. It's all about, how can we maximize our profits? And again, like I said, I get it. You're a business. Your goal is to make money. Mm-hmm. However, we see the trickle-down effect to college athletics. Mm-hmm. And I'm all for athletes getting theirs. I mean, I do think if they're going to be bringing in – if the NCAA is going to be bringing in, billions and they're going to be a tax-exempt organization, then I think the players should be able to, get a slice of that. But I do think, in terms of – looking collegiately, how money has ruined it. You talk about like rivalries and conferences, and you've got UCLA and USC playing in the Big Ten now. Does that make sense to me? No, it doesn't. I mean, you're kind of, throwing away years of tradition there and rivalry and the great part about things like college are the pageantry and the passion of it.
Yeah.
And when you have teams in the Pacific time zone playing teams in the Central time zone and the Eastern time zone, but again, I go back to like what you said though, not to get off on a tangent about that, but it is obviously profit driven. You have to find a way to bring in the money, but it's one of those kind of a wait and see, I guess.
Yeah.
No one has the actual answer. None of us are Nostradamus. We can't look into the future as much as we would like to. I'd like to know what the future holds. We won't know if the U.S. can support 2 domestic professional women's soccer leagues until we see it. I will say that I think the thing that threw everybody for a loop was the entire lead up to the Super League announcement. It was the USL had indicated that they were going to seek Division II classification,
right,
which would not be top flight. It would be a rung under, similar to what we see USL Championship versus MLS.
Yep.
And then the announcement came out, and sort of buried there in the bottom was, we're going to attempt to seek Division I classification, which would put it on the same playing field as the NWSL. And I think that's when everybody was like, hold on a minute. I think that's why the MLS can coexist with the USL pyramid structure on the men's side, because there isn't that direct competitor. You see MLS teams poach USL championship guys from time to time. You see other professional leagues overseas poach USL championship guys from time to time. So I do think, it's yet to be seen if the if the USL championship does ultimately get that Division I classification from the United Soccer Federation. If they don't, then we don't have to have this conversation, right? There doesn't have to be anything to worry about because it's not a direct competitor.
Right. So we kind of waded into an intersection with sports, money, college, everything like that. Before we go to that point, we can land this plane. For Aurora next year, if your benchmark of success is winning the championship, and if you are an athlete or a coach, it is, what needs to happen in your mind?
Ooh, that's such a good question. Put me on the hot seat here.
Oh, yeah.
And because I think before you can even, and not to sort of dodge the answer, but I think before you can even broach that question, you have to get a layout of what your roster is going to look like, because you're getting to the point now. So a lot of your players from the first season came back this year. Are they going to come back next year? Are players like an Adler, a French, a Harris, even a Kennedy Faulkner, are they going to be back this time next year? So I think you have to. I think if you're Nicole Lukic and the coaching staff, you have to get a lay of, one, players, but two, also the coach. I mean, it's very rare that a team at this level brings back an entire coaching staff from year to year. And they did. I mean, they brought back all four coaches, the head coach and the assistants. And so I do think you have to kind of get a lay of the land there. Are your coaches, are majority of your players going to come back? Because if the answer to either of those questions or both is no, then you've got to completely change the way you attack next year. Do you change your tactics? Do you change things schematically? I know Nicole Lukic is a big firm believer in, and we saw this year, they were the highest scoring team in the league. Hey, we want to just bludgeon people offensively. But if Maya Hansen, Hannah Adler, and those players don't come back, do you shift more to a defensive-minded, we're going to play closer score lines. We're going to focus more on the back end of things. And so, I think at this level, I think it's almost like an arms race. I think in order to get to the to be honest, I just think in order to get to the final and win it all next year, you just go gobble up as much talent as you possibly can. Yeah. Even, whether it necessarily fits with your tactics or not, I think you just get as many talented players. You just stack the deck. I mean, essentially, you just become an all-star ringer team, and you run through the league again. I mean,
that Houston Nut thing, stockpile all the quarterbacks so they make rules against you.
Exactly. No, I mean, I don't see anywhere in the USLW league rules that says you can't do that, and so I do think it'll be interesting to see how they attack things next year, or if they're even in the W League next year. I mean, those are conversations that could be had later on this year about, hey, what's our future look like? I know, obviously, you being a sports reporter, you know this. There were conversations last year after the initial season of, hey, do we move on up? Do we try to do this? And then that becomes, if you do move up, probably you're looking at that point replacing the entire roster. Yeah. You'll have to get a different quality, a different caliber of player. And that's no knock on any of the players on the roster now. But I mean, there's a far Grand Canyon sized gap between a W League roster and a top flight professional league roster. Yeah.
Which brings you to another question as well. Like that will bring up the stadium question. And I mean, I know you've been around the Metro and you've seen where all the stadiums are located, all the arenas, and what goes where and how it operates. And I mean, that is another question, another topic for another day. But, I think for the most part, you could never call this team anything but a success.
Absolutely. No, it's been a home run. I mean, and I do think it gets into the conversation. We're starting to see, like Draymond Green, the new media, right? We're seeing players starting to take over this discussion at all levels about how do we gauge success as a player, right? And we're moving away from the idea that the only way to gauge success is if you win championships. That's not the end all be all. I mean, there have been Are you going to look at me and tell me Charles Barkley is a failure as a player because he never won an NBA championship? Or, Hakeem isn't a successful player because he only won 2 championships compared to guys who won 6 and 7. I mean, no. So I don't think, and I think that conversation extends to a franchise like Aurora as well. The end-all, be-all can't just be yes or no, did you win a championship? Yes? Okay, success. No? Oh, you're a failure. Nuance. I mean, I know that we live in a time, especially on social media, where our discussions lack nuance as a society, and that's probably the understatement of the year.
Yeah.
But I do think that these conversations about success and failure have to be nuanced. You have to look at it not just through a black and white, yes or no, you won, you didn't win. And I think when you look at it from that frame of reference, Minnesota Aurora are a slam dunk home run success because they could have rolled out here last year and gone winless. I mean, there were new teams in this league that did go winless, that won 1 game or 2 matches or what have you. And I promise you that, they feel bad about the fact they only won 1 or 2 matches, but those teams aren't saying, you know what, we're a failure because 365 days ago we didn't exist and now we won, 2 matches? Now, if they come out here and go winless next year, then they'll say, okay, well, we need to reevaluate some things. But the fact that Minnesota has run through 2 regular seasons undefeated, they've made the playoffs twice. I mean, like I said, last year's defending champions didn't even make the playoffs this year. So, I think it's absolutely, as unequivocally as I can say it, Minnesota Aurora are a success.
Love it. And as we continue talking about soccer, I mean, the Americas are about to be just loaded with it, right? Like the Gold Cup happening now, the World Cup on its way, qualifiers happening all over the continent. Like just the embarrassment of soccer that we're about to have. Now, do you think this shifts, or I say shifts as in increases the attention to the sport or the interest in the sport, or is it already here?
I think so. For people that don't know, I'm from St. Louis. I grew up in St. Louis, and St. Louis was one of those places when I was coming up was a hotbed for soccer. We had St. Louis FC, which they did away with, and then they got the MLS team, St. Louis City SC, who right now is running roughshod on the Western Conference. I mean, every time I look at the table, they're at the top, and so I'm of the mindset that soccer is big. Now, is it as big as the Big Four here in America? No, it's not. I do think it could be. I think that if we dedicate the proper resources to it and the proper media attention to it, it could be. I think that also involves getting the right voices talking about the sport as well. But, so I think soccer in America is big. It hasn't tapped its potential yet. I think getting a World Cup is going to help. Especially in the modern time. I know that the U.S. has hosted World Cups before, but in the modern day and age, I think it's important that they're going to have this. And I think by extension, my family lives in Canada. The fact that the United States, Mexico, and Canada are going to share this World Cup coming up, I think that's important too, because Canada, although they have won some domestic cups and they played a tough match against the United States the other day, Canada even doesn't dedicate enough resources to their men's and women's national teams. And we see, I forget what it was. Was it the men's or women's team threatened to walk out and said they just weren't going to play because they weren't getting paid what they felt like they should? So I think it'll help. I look at it from the other standpoint too. You touched on it, and I don't really talk a whole lot about my past life, but for the last 6 years prior to moving here, I did work at Marshall University athletics. And for those that don't know, when I got there, the men's soccer team at Marshall was dreadful. They hosted a conference tournament that they didn't even qualify for. The coach retired. They hired Chris Grassi, who you know from covering him at University of Charleston.
I do.
From Newcastle,
Division
England.
II.
Yeah, Division II. Took him right to the brink there. I mean, should have probably won multiple national championships. Just unlucky, came up short at the last minute.
Shouts out to Dan Stratford bringing that home.
Exactly. Yeah. Of course, now he's at
West Virginia University.
He's at the other Division I university.
Also, I believe he's engaged now, too.
I don't even keep up with strats as much as I probably should. I will say
I don't, and I actually should.
Yeah, he's a great guy. I mean,
he is.
Both of them, he and Grassi, and Smee, current coach at University of Charleston, he'll get a D1 job at some point.
No question.
That Grassi coaching tree is about to be like 100-year-old weeping willow. I mean, that thing is going to be sturdy for a while.
Yeah.
So Grassi, I got there. I was finishing up college when Bob Gray, the old coach at Marshall, retired. Soccer, nobody cared about soccer. I mean, say what you want about West Virginia, but the one thing I will say is that they didn't care about soccer. They do now. And it's a product of Grassi got there, reinfused the program. It took him a couple years, but then they went from winning 6 matches. I mean, I remember the first match I covered working at Marshall, broadcasting on TV. They lost to Eastern Illinois. It was Grassi's home debut. They lost to EIU. 4 years later, they win the Division I national championship down in Cary, North Carolina. And now you can't get a ticket on game day to a Marshall men's soccer match. And some of that's bled over to the women's soccer team as well, because they've started bundling season tickets together and doing that sort of co-scheduling where they'll have home matches on the same day. So much so that when I left Marshall, one of the last things Grassi showed me were plans to expand the soccer facility and build second levels and new press boxes and extensions into stands and away bleachers and all these things. And it's because they've been a consistent winner. I think at the end of the day, you and I know this covering sports.
Yes.
Winning cures everything.
Yeah.
I think that one of the reasons that maybe the focus on men's soccer hasn't exploded in America as much is, call it what it is, the men's national team here in America, it's not like they've been a dominant force, right? I mean, they've had great players on their team. They just haven't gone deep. I mean, we are, as a nation, the United States is one of, if not the most developed nation on the face of this earth. We have more professional sports resources than any other country, right?
If the men's team performed like the women's team does.
Exactly. And that's the other thing. And at one of my last jobs, I earned this reputation for being the equity guy, right? And it was used sort of in a derogatory way.
Yeah, but people think it's pejorative, but
but I kind of wore it as a badge of honor because the way I looked at it was, what we do for XYZ men's team is what we should do for XYZ women's team. I mean, it should be, that's how it should be. If we're going to say, hey, let's have all these theme nights for the men's team, and then we're just going to say, oh yeah, and then the women's team exists. No, we should put as much focus on them as we do on the other team, especially if your women's team is actually having more success than their men's counterpart. I mean, that's just, to me, and I think that conversation is one that should be had for the women's national team. The women's national team are the top team in the world. I mean, they dominate everybody, right?
Yep.
And of course, I know that they had a sort of a slog of a match against Wales, but it's a tune-up, right? I mean, nobody's losing their minds over that. But, the women's national team in America is regarded as the best national team in the world. And I don't really see, there are people that talk about it. There are people that focus on it. And I know they're expecting to see more viewers for this Women's World Cup than what we've ever seen before. But still, there should be, if you're a true just soccer fan, right? Not men's soccer, not just a soccer fan, a diehard, man, you should be tuning into that. It shouldn't be like, hey, the women's team won. When are we going to see this for the men? Like, you can ask that question, but you should, I guess what I'm trying to say is the attention that we give the lack of success that the men have had,
which is so strange.
Which is
this
weird.
is the only place we do this.
Right. We should be also giving that much.
We don't. We don't even do that with
No.
I mean, we didn't do it with the Cleveland Browns when they were 0 everything.
No.
We did just to make fun of them. Like, are they going to be winless this year? Let's make fun of them.
Exactly. And that's my thing, is every time I see a conversation about the success the women's national team has, it then is, man, the women's national team, they're so dominant. When are the men going to catch up? And it should just be, we should just celebrate the successes of the women's national team in America. We can still ask the question, hey, why can't the men achieve that? But we should also, as loudly as we vocalize, hey, our men's national team sucks, they need to get better, we should be equaling that with a celebration of how great our women's national team is.
Right.
And I do think we hear people talk about it, but I don't think that conversation is talked about enough about just how good they are.
Right.
On its own, detached from the conversation of why aren't their men's counterpart as successful. And so I think hosting a World Cup in this country is going to be huge for the explosion of soccer. But I do think that it's going to take the men's team going deep and having some sustained success to be able to do it. I think they have the roster to do it, especially with some of the signings that they've had recently.
Goodness.
I mean, they're starting to stockpile the talent on this team, and that's that's what they need. I mean, the whole thing with the men's national team has always been, if the best athletes in America would play soccer, we'd win 1 million World Cups in men's soccer. And it's true. I mean, imagine if a guy like Odell Beckham Jr. had stuck with soccer instead of going to, but at the same time, I do think, I know I saw this the other day. Someone criticized Pulisic for going to AC Milan instead of staying here in the MLS when the transfer window opened. I do think we also have to understand that our domestic league is nowhere near close to what we see in other countries' domestic leagues. So if you want your players to get better and challenge themselves, you can't say, the discussion was he should have stayed home and gotten a bigger payday than what he's getting at AC Milan ahead of the World Cup. But if you want a guy like Pulisic to tap into his full potential, he needs to play against. I mean, what do football coaches always say? Good on good, right?
Pretty much.
Iron sharpens iron.
Much.
You need to go play in places that have the best club talent in the world.
Yes. Well, and I think Major League Soccer and Don Garber, they're quite. I find this shrewd, and I don't say that in a negative sense. And I say shrewd as in this is a good thing, right? Like the Leagues Cup. Now, I know that there was a little bit of confusion about that with the Major League Soccer Players Association. They're like, what are we doing with this, right? Because they announced it. They shot from the hip, really, when they announced this thing. And they're like, yeah, you're going to go play against the Mexican teams in a cup format mid-season. Why not? Like, the idea that they're going to basically take what they do with the All-Star game. They go and play a Premier League side or some other European League team. And they're like, look, everybody else's club system's pretty freaking good.
Yeah.
We are catching up. We need to, push that knee a little bit further. And you're, A, raising the profile of Major League Soccer, B, raising its value, C, raising your talent with it. And, I mean, we talked to Adrian Heath as he coached last year's All-Star team. And, he kind of made the point that the fees that they're getting for players getting bought from MLS are rising. They've been rising. They continue to rise. And even with a kid like Sung-Min Jung they have now, they're like, no, we're going to develop this dude and then sell him.
Yeah.
Like, we are not afraid of that. No. We're not afraid of selling this dude. Like, he's a fantastic player. He has incredible potential. Yeah. We'll develop him. We'll sell him.
And that's having a trickle-down effect to the USL Championship.
Exactly.
Because, what was it? Was it Weish? Josh Weish from Racing Louisville just got signed for a record fee. It was like millions to a European club from the USL Championship. Yeah. And I think that opens the discussion. And this is one of the things that I've been sort of displeased with the discourse. I hate that word, but the discourse around professional soccer in America. Because there's been this kind of like the MLS almost – I feel like the MLS sort of looks down its nose at the Open Cup. I know Don Garber's been vocal about maybe wanting to pull MLS teams out of that, but I think that's bad for the development of soccer in America because you talk about the trickle-down effect. I mean, that has an immense positive impact on those NISA, or I forget the acronym for it, but those like independent leagues and those smaller leagues. I mean, imagine if the Prem League said, you know what, we're not going to put any of our teams in the FA Cup. That'd be silly.
Unthinkable.
That'd be silly.
Unthinkable.
One of the great things about watching the FA Cup is watching David go up against Goliath and having the opportunity to topple them.
Yes.
And if that means that you as an MLS team have to go travel to the Maryland Bobcats FC once, okay, you'll be okay. That's okay. Do that. I mean, because you know what? Because that stadium's going to sell out.
No question.
People are going to come flock to that. It's going to infuse money into that club that probably needs it because they're an independent league soccer team. And that's going to, then people are going to say, oh, hey, Maryland Bobcats. I've never heard of them. I'm going to watch this. I'm going to check this out. Do I think there needs to be some quality standards set into it in terms of like broadcasting? Because I know that's been one of the questions of you have some people that set up their phone because they don't have the broadcasting infrastructure.
Yeah.
And then you have MLS teams playing them on ESPN Plus, right, or USL Championship teams playing them on ESPN. Do I think there needs to be some sort of quality standard put in place? Absolutely, I do. But I don't think you should yank your top flight professional teams out of the Open Cup. I think that does, you talk about growing soccer in America, I think that has a tremendous impact on the growth of soccer in America.
I would say on a counterpoint there, why MLS would get away from the Open Cup. Same reason West Virginia don't want to play Marshall in anything.
Right. It doesn't serve to help you. It can only hurt you. Right.
Yeah. Same reason. Because I look back at last year's where it was Sacramento and Orlando. And somebody may or may not have been cheating.
Yeah.
And MLS ended up winning that one. But the idea that obviously the pride shows up. Obviously we don't want our league looking bad. But you look at that, I mean, obviously from a business model standpoint, you're like, oh, no, please no. But if the insinuation that comes along with that is your second tier teams can go toe to toe with your first tier teams, it's not necessarily the indictment on the first tier that people might think it is.
No, absolutely not. I mean, we see Premier League teams they lose in the FA Cup. I mean, it's not, and nobody's like, oh wow, the Premier League, they're terrible. Their team lost to a League Two team in the FA Cup. You know, and other domestic cups like that. Nobody says that. It's only in America where we're like hyper fixated on the wins and losses and what this means and it being some larger meaning. Sometimes there is no larger meaning. Sometimes it's just, hey, that team played better today than this team did, and they win. You know, you could 9 times out of 10, the MLS team's going to beat that team. But that one time they played, the smaller market team won. A 1 out of 10 chance that they win just happened to be that day. That doesn't mean, you know, and I know people use that, like you talked about, as a way to dog the MLS, like, you know, oh, it's a retirement league, you know, blah, blah, blah. But no, it's not. Like,
retirement, okay, Leo Messi's not coming over here to retire. I mean, maybe he is going to retire. Maybe he isn't. He is still, I mean, he's sold out tickets for that club, Inter Miami, for this season.
And for him, it's a smart business decision, too.
Well, yeah.
Because he's getting portions of kit sales. He's getting in on the Apple TV deal with the MLS season pass. I mean, in addition to, you know, he's still getting to play soccer, and he's very clearly persuasive enough to convince a bunch of his buddies to come over here and play. You know, the question becomes, where's Miami getting all this money for these transfer fees?
Well, yeah. I mean, it's Miami, man. You can find money in Miami.
No, this is true.
Yeah. All right, so we're talking about soccer, and the first thing that jumped out to me, we just kind of mentioned this to you before we got started here, was the NBA's in-season tournament. They have just called the NBA Cup, and looking at the structure of the format of this thing happening in the middle of the season while the regular season is going on, and has basically some more or less imperceptible impact on the NBA's season itself. I've got to look deeper into that. But first thing that jumped out was, that's a mid-season soccer tournament. How is this going to work with the NBA? And would people even like this idea?
You know, I'm of the mindset. So I love basketball. Basketball's fantastic. It's one of my favorite sports to broadcast. You know, it's just such an entertaining sport to watch. I don't think more basketball is a bad thing. I think the question becomes, in terms of the NBA, how are the players going to respond to it? You know, I know with the load management, type stuff that we've seen where players will say, which I'm not opposed to at all. I mean, I think if you're talking about in terms of, go back to Grassi, right? Grassi always had this saying that it's a marathon, not a sprint. I know it's not his saying, but that was one of his ways of criticizing the college soccer calendar.
Right.
Was because college soccer was a sprint when in actuality the sport you're playing demands a marathon.
Right.
So by the end of the season, it's not indicative of who the best teams actually are because you're cramming all of this in. But I digress. I'm totally cool with the load management thing because, again, it is a marathon, not a sprint. If you're trying to have your best teams playing being the last team standing, then yeah, sometimes you are going to have to take a night or two off. So I think the real question becomes, how are the players going to handle? Are we going to see LeBron playing in the NBA Cup?
If his foot's okay.
Right, if his foot's okay. Are we going to see, and I know that he gets a bad rap for his injuries, but are we going to see a guy like Anthony Davis want to gamble and roll the dice and say, you know what, I'm going to play, I don't know how many extra games is it?
Right.
A handful of them, and run the risk of, potentially getting injured that could impact my team's season later. And so I do think that's the conversation that players are going to be having amongst themselves is, hey, especially because if I'm not mistaken, the championship game stats don't actually count.
No.
So it really, it really has no impact on your season stats. And so I think that is a very logical question that NBA players are going to ask. Hey, is this worth me gambling with my physical health if my goal is to win an actual NBA championship? This NBA Cup would be great to have in the trophy case, but does it mean anything at the end of the year? And on the flip side,
the guys will get paid.
Right,
for this,
guys will get paid.
Obviously, there's a prize pool for this, but you're otherwise not going to be. You looking for that Larry O'Brien trophy?
Mm-hmm.
You're like, well, what is this?
Yeah.
This thing.
I think it does open an interesting conversation to have, though, because when you look at, you mentioned it's very similar to a soccer midseason cup. A lot of times there will be teams that won't trot their first team out there. They'll have some second teamers or what have you on those rosters. I do think that this might be a good opportunity if you're trying to figure out a way to thrust the G League into more of a public conversation. This might be a good opportunity to say, I'm a big believer in talking about what I know. So Tavion Kinsey, right? Signed Exhibit 10 deal with the Utah Jazz.
Yep.
Essentially, for those that don't know, that means it can be converted into a two-way contract. Yep. He can play for the Utah Jazz G League team and also potentially appear for the Utah Jazz, the main roster.
Right.
This might be a good opportunity to say, hey, Tavion Kinsey, you're going to be the sixth man for our NBA Cup. And what does that do? That gets him iron sharpens iron, good on good. It gets him competition with – because there are going to be some NBA starting caliber players that are going to say, I love the game so much, I'm going to play, regardless.
Yes.
Whether it means anything or not.
Well, it'll be the Anthony Edwards type who's
exactly.
How many times is someone going to get to see me play?
Yeah, dudes just want to hoop
every single game.
Yeah, because, there are guys, and that's what I love about sports like the NBA, leagues like the NBA, because you've got some guys who are like, my main goal is to win a championship. Whatever I can do to keep myself in shape and healthy to win a championship, that's my goal. And some guys who are just like, hey, man, this is what I grew up loving. This is the sport I love. I'm getting paid a king's ransom to play a child's game. I just want to hoop. Championships are cool, but you know what else is cool? Playing.
Yep.
And so you're going to have some guys that are going to say, I don't care if this negatively impacts my ability to be fresh for the playoffs. Just more basketball, right? And this might be a good opportunity for you to get G League guys some good reps at the top level. And that only can serve to help. NBA teams are always so concerned about their future, right? That's why we see teams stockpile these draft picks and what can we do for the future? And, we're going to shut this guy down. Like I think the Trailblazers did it last year with Dame, right? They shut him down. They were like, there's no chance we're making the playoffs. We're shutting you down for our future. And, so this might be a good opportunity for you to say, let's look to the future. If we can throw, sink or swim, if we can throw a guy like a Tavion Kinsey out there, I'm just throwing his name out there because he's Marshall guy, he's who I know. Yes. If we can throw a G League guy out there, see how he responds, and oh my gosh, he just put up 38. This might be a guy that we can say finish up your G League season, and then next year let's convert that two-way contract into a main roster contract.
I think it's to that point. I mean, a name people recognize around here, Luka Garza, could
Absolutely.
get a whole lot more.
Yeah,
like he does get some minutes for the Timberwolves themselves, but to get him more involved. I mean, I guess the nature of the game has changed in a way that, like, your front court's got to be more mobile, and that's just kind of what it has to be. You got to be able to shoot some, got to do your thing, which, again, this brings us into the Timberwolves are playing with 3 bigs now.
Yeah.
All right. Okay. But that said, I mean, in fairness, they are a little bit more mobile in their bigs. But, no, I like this idea now that we're talking more about it.
And it extends to rotation players, too, because, that's the one thing, talking to as many collegiate basketball players as I've talked to, I've had to interview. I mean, a name like Shayna Gore comes to mind, which, quick shout out, new assistant coach at Western Carolina. Western Carolina, she's a full-time assistant coach, just wrapped up a GA tenure in Indiana with Terry Morin and the Hoosiers. So now Shayna's moved on to the coaching ranks. Congratulations to her. But, talking to a player like her, basketball is such a confidence-driven type of game, and injuries can happen at any time. So would it not behoove you to have more opportunities to get your fringe rotation players, opportunities to develop a rhythm, to develop confidence? So even if your Karl Anthony Towns says, you know what, guys, I'm going to sit out the NBA Cup. Okay, well, move a fringe rotation player guy up a slot on the depth chart for the NBA Cup. And then if the Timberwolves make the playoffs and they have a player get injured, well, now you have a guy who can probably step into a bigger role a lot easier. Yeah, because he's had some minutes during the regular, and not in garbage time where it's, we're losing 1-0 to nothing. Just throw up a bunch of random shots. I mean, we've all seen the last couple minutes of a blowout game. There's no rhyme or reason or semblance. I mean, these are just guys that are just hooping out there. There's no, anything going on. But in a true competitive style game, if you can get your fringe rotation players some more minutes, hey, playoff time rolls around, and we saw with the Heat, Tyler Hero, a game into the playoffs, broke his hand. And the Miami Heat were fortunate that their rotation and role players were more than willing to step into that role. Yeah. But, what happens if those guys weren't ready for that spotlight and they were cold and just, hey, you have no choice because we're down a player now? Yeah, and I guess it's trying to make games matter in ways that, if you look at a whole regular season, you're like, how much does this matter? It matters, of course, once you get to seeding, once you get to playoffs, where all that lines up and how your guys develop over time. But if you're saying here's an incentive, by the way, I can see why you'd want to make that move. But of course, we talk about what people are used to, tradition, and everything else, like how you get people to swallow this idea and be like, yeah, well, maybe okay. I mean, basketball heads will probably like this, get their heads around some of the formatting and group stage, knockout stage, championship, whatever else. But this is interesting. I think if you want to incentivize it, my mind immediately goes, if you're trying to incentivize it to get your best players to play, I think you do something like, hey, the winner of this thing gets to host the NBA. If you make it to the NBA Finals, you're the host team. Or determine hosting of the finals based on how you finish within this NBA Cup. And I bring this up because, the play-in is so much fun. It is everything on the line. You're almost in the playoffs, but not quite. Mm-hmm. It's very NCAA tournament-esque. Yeah. It gives me a little bit of the same vibes. It's because that's the one thing, and my dad and I have talked about this, and I know why they do these 7-game series, because more TV money. Yeah, of course. Sometimes a 7-game series in the NBA playoffs can be a little bit of a slog. It is a little hard to devote your entire attention to a whole 7-game series. So I do like even though it's not one and done, if you lose, you're out necessarily. I do like the play-in because it does have that feeling of, hey, we've got this is the only game we're guaranteed. so to speak. We've got to give it our all here. And so I kind of like to play in.
I mean, you got to run it to somebody's face and then go play a 7-game chess match with somebody else. Like, I don't mind a 7-game series for that reason. Like, your first game is like, all right, you're gonna see what that is.
Yeah, feeling out.
Yeah, your first few games at each arena, you're like, this is what it is here, this is what it is there, this is how they do this and that. Like, your adjustments happen, like, obviously on a micro level at half times, but like you're talking macro level adjustments from game to game.
Yeah.
Like, how do we, like, we play our game? Yes, but like, how is this going to change once they know what your game is and decide we're not letting you play it?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that is and I see collegiate fan bases talk about this in basketball with the NCAA tournament. You look at Virginia. I did some freelance work with University of Virginia earlier this year. Go Hoos, Wilbur. Shout out Wilbur DeLashman there in the athletic department. I feel like I'm an adopted son of UVA because I've done so many games for them. So I was very interested in their first round matchup with Furman in the NCAA tournament this year. I go back to the 9 times out of 10 conversation. Do I think Furman 9 times out of 10 is going to beat UVA? Probably not. Now, Furman was a lot better team than what anybody gave them credit for. I thought they were criminally underseeded this year, especially with guys like Mike Bothwell on their roster. But, if that was a multi-game series, the things that Furman was doing to stymie Virginia's game plan, Tony Bennett is an excellent coach. He's going to adjust that. So sort of what you're talking about there of the 7-game series versus the 1 single elimination format. There are pros and cons to both.
Yep, that is true. And, you bring up Wilbur. I love that dude.
Wilbur.
But I was thinking about our group chats when we talk about like things going on in college athletics. And needless to say, it has been a week in college athletics. I mean, Northwestern's had some real problems.
Yes.
I kind of talked about this a bit on Monday with just the things that happen in a program. Like, you can only say, I didn't know, but so much. And even then, when it gets to something of this magnitude, I didn't know goes from ignorance to negligence and then crosses a line even into like, I condone it. Types of things like that firing had to happen.
Right. It's funny that you bring this up because I actually had this conversation today in the workplace with somebody, and I'll borrow a phrase from an athletic director that I know in talking about coaches. They're the CEO of their program. So if you look at a business setting, if you have misconduct prevalent in your business setting, the buck stops with the chief executive officer, and him saying, I don't know, that's not an acceptable response in the workplace. So it shouldn't be any different in collegiate athletics because at the end of the day, that is also a workplace. So at minimum, let's operate under the assumption that Fitzgerald didn't know. When you're the executive of your workplace, it is one of the, even if it's not written and spelled out, one of the understood functions of your job is you have to know what's going on at every level of your workplace. So if we operate under the assumption he didn't know, at a minimum, he was not able to perform one of the functions of his job, which was know what's going on inside your workplace. So that in and of itself there disqualifies him from being the CEO because he just, couldn't execute one of the functions of the job.
I mean, the NCAA gets after people for institutional control, lack thereof.
Exactly.
All the time.
Exactly. So now this conversation can range from he just simply didn't know, which means that he's not fit to hold that job because he couldn't execute those duties, all the way up to maybe a more sinister conversation of he knew and was condoning it, which is something that some of the allegations have been on social media. Now,
I didn't know and I didn't want to know.
Exactly, which, that also is sinister, too, because if you say, I didn't want to know, that does imply you knew and you just stuck your fingers in your ear and said, I don't hear you. And that's not acceptable either. So I'm not going to pretend that I knew what was going on inside that locker room. I have no affiliation with Northwestern. I've never even been there. I know one gentleman who writes for Sports Illustrated that is a Northwestern alum. But the thing that I go back to is, no matter how you feel about this situation, I don't know how many scandals it's going to take in college athletics before we collectively say, hey, maybe covering scandals up is not the way to go about this.
Yeah.
I mean,
yes.
It is. I mean, we do this. I mean, I feel like we do this same song and dance all the time in college athletics, where you're reactive to situations instead of proactive, or you are actively participating in a cover-up of said scandal. I mean, maybe I'm wrong, and I'm not. And again, I'm not trying to be a hypocrite. We're human. We all lie, right? I lie. I've lied to people before. It happens. But this is not something you lie about, right?
No.
Saying, hey, when you're a teenager saying, yeah, Mom, I'm totally over at my friend's house, and you're, hanging out with your buddies somewhere else. That happens. But lying and a lie of omission is still a lie. Mm-hmm. So lying in this case about what's going on inside your workplace, I mean, that's wrong. You shouldn't do that, especially if your job as a coach is to be a leader of young men or young women. I mean, one of the things a coach does, and I know this from interacting with coaches, they go in the home of these players and they say, hey, your child is going to be safe with me when they come to my campus for 4 or 5 years. You can trust me with your child. Well, this flies directly in the face of that.
Yeah.
I mean, this again, I want to give it the whole, these are allegations, we have to operate under the assumption innocent until proven guilty, whatever. So if this was happening, if what these people are saying is what happened, which all signs point to yes, based on the number of them, I mean, where there's smoke, there's fire, the number of allegations that come out, this directly flies in the face of the idea that not only are you a leader of young men, in this case with a football team, but that these young men, you told their parents, send your child to me. They will be safe under my watch.
Yes.
That flies in the face of both of those things, which are the core tenets of being a coach at any level.
Yeah. See, college athletics to me, I mean, we participate in it and we love a lot of things about it. And there are a lot of things about it that I find myself just more at odds with as I get older. And it is a lot of the, as we talk about, yes, we love the pageantry, we love the tradition, we love the passion of things that happen, but we also sort of have to accept, and we sort of talk ourselves into accepting that, like, yeah, I mean, this is a whole lot of the, you can tell us they're amateurs, I suppose, but, Cardale Jones gave the game away, right? Like, yeah. We came to play football. We didn't come to play class.
Well, and I've never talked openly about my departure from collegiate athletics.
Right.
There are people who they try to surmise what happened. And I'll tell you, everyone has been completely off base. I walked away from collegiate athletics because of what you just said. Because the longer you're around it, you start to realize it's kind of at odds with what I believe as a person. I am unabashed, love college athletics. I prefer college to professional. I know that sounds crazy because I work for essentially a professional. It's a pre-professional. But I love covering collegiate athletics. I've loved it since I was a kid playing the NCAA football and basketball video games. My dad and I have this debate all the time. He loves professional sports. I like professional sports, but I'd much rather watch college football over pro football or college basketball over pro basketball.
I'd agree.
And so it's almost, I don't want to be over dramatic, but it's almost a heartbreaking conversation because when you start working there, it's in collegiate athletics, you're this naive, wide-eyed, and the more you spend around it, and I spent over a half decade there. I mean, I'm 27. I started working in collegiate athletics when I was 20. I just turned 27 in May, so I spent 6 years. I basically spent my entire adult life in collegiate athletics. And that's not to I'm not accusing anybody of anything by any means. It's just the structure of the workplace, the things that you're expected to do, it's just not, it wasn't for me. It wasn't what I was interested in. And some of it was at odds with how I feel about the way the world works or should work. And I just realized, is this really what I want to do with the rest of my life? No. I'm more passionate, as passionate I am about college sports, I'm more passionate about broadcasting them. So I'd rather go off on my own and do my own thing, roll the dice, and focus on finding a job that allows me to cover them while not being inside of the building. After 6 years, I realized I have no interest in being in one of the cogs of the machine in the inner workings of collegiate athletics. I just didn't want to.
Right.
And various amount of reasons. So does it sound crazy to say that at the age of 26, once I was off my parents' insurance under, Obamacare, I walked away from a job as a state employee with state benefits? Yeah, it sounds crazy. And I waltzed into the freelance world, but it's worth it. I'm more fulfilled as a human being.
Yeah.
And again, it goes back to that conversation of there are things with college sports, not anything criminal or heinous or violating someone's sense of being per se, but just things that you're just like, I don't really like that. That's not how I feel about life. That's not how I feel about how this should go. And after a while, those things start to build and you just say, I don't really want this anymore. I want to do something different.
Yeah. Yeah. And again, the more we think about it, the more we talk about it, we're seeing in legislature as they talk about antitrust situations with PGA and LIV, that situation being what it is, to suddenly bring up, and again, saying the quiet part out loud, to suddenly bring up that college athletes are now not necessarily equitably able to get a piece of that pie, but at the very least, they're able to go and pursue their own, monetization based on what they do, who they are, their visibility of it. And to bring that up in the context of the antitrust lawsuit, again, kind of pulls back the curtain on this in ways that you're like, ooh, did you mean to do that?
Yeah.
Because that's a little uncomfortable. If you listen to the statement that this legislator made, you're like, some dog whistly about that one. But also, you mean to tell me you want these kids broke?
Well, and it also feels like moving the goalposts, because I remember a time when it was unfathomable, I should say, that college athletes not only could get compensated, but make money off their name, image, and likeness.
Yeah.
And so I've always felt like, and I was working in college athletics when the NIL thing came about. I remember, it was people were trying to scramble to make sense of it, whatever. But I always felt like name, image, and likeness was a good middle ground. If you as an institution or as an association, in this case the NCAA, are going to say the athletes can't have a piece of the pie, but we're going to allow them to still pursue money-making ventures, to me, that's the only middle ground that can happen. And now you're starting to see, now that we have name, image, and likeness, you're seeing people say, well, hold on a minute. Whoa. Well, those same people were always saying, the athletes, they shouldn't get paid by the school. Well, they're not being paid by the school. Now, you can have the conversation about the trusts and all that, the NIL trusts. But at the end of the day, if I'm Joe Athlete and I play for, I'll use an NCAA
college
football.
university.
Yeah, FCS Southeast, right? Like those old random generated NCAA football teams.
There's that Key and Peele sketch.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I'm a successful athlete at that level. And a local business wants to say, hey, I'd like to use your face or have you be in my advertisement, and I'm going to pay you $25,000 to do it. I think it's silly to say that that shouldn't be allowed. The school has nothing to do with that. In fact, these businesses, without an express written permission and compensation back to the school, they can't use the school's marks, logos, color scheme, any of it. I go back to, my time at Marshall. I remember there was the quarterback at Marshall. He had transferred in from another school, and it was right after they beat Notre Dame last year. Downtown, smack downtown, close to Hal Greer Boulevard, they had a picture of him it was clearly a photo that was an action shot of him from that game, and they had scrubbed they even scrubbed the helmet stripes off of it, because even something like that they didn't have access to, and they weren't willing to fork over the licensing for it, because those can be very expensive.
Yes.
And it was just him. It was just him. Now, you knew, if you lived in Huntington, West Virginia, you knew where this player played at. It was obvious. You probably watched him play that weekend against Notre Dame. So, but he was the only one getting a kickback from that, because it was him. They'd scrubbed all the marks and logos and branding and all that. Even the Nike logo, you name it. Even the conference logo, they scrubbed off of him. I mean, even so much as so, I'm pretty sure if I remember correctly, they ended up having to superimpose a different jersey font on him because that had the school's colors in it. I mean, so, and I do think this is sort of where I take umbrage with a lot of the NIL discussion, and that's the messaging has been horrendous. And I blame the NCAA for that, because they kind of just said, here, you deal with it. You know, if you're the governing body of anything, you've got to be the front lines. You cannot leave it up to your member institutions to carry the banner for you. Now, they can participate in it, but you
can do this if you want nothing to do with it in the first place.
Well, right, exactly.
Like that's there's your other elephant in the room. Like, we don't really want this, but if y'all gonna sue us, have it.
Exactly. And so, but if you want it to be successful, I guess is what I should say, you've got to be the driver of this information. Because as we know, and I'm just gonna say it, I have no beef with anybody, but the average person, they're not gonna go seek the information out for themselves.
Generally, no.
I mean, I do think that the advent of social media, because of the expedience of the information, and it's just kind of there for us. Yeah. We've gotten a little lazy as a society. The information is given to us. We don't necessarily seek it out for ourselves. Now, I think it's good to do that. Being obviously journalists, we have
media literacy is in I would say short supply, and for only the reason that folks don't always understand what that means. So I guess, as an aside.
No, absolutely. I agree. Absolutely. And I think that's been the biggest failure of the name, image, and likeness era of collegiate athletics, is that they just kind of said, this is a thing, and there was no further information. And the schools also haven't really provided a whole lot of information as to what name, image, and likeness. I still see people in the NIL conversation on social media spaces talk about how we should do away with the name, image, and likeness because the schools are paying the players. No, that's not what's happening. In fact, the NCAA came out, or no, I'm not sure. I don't know what group came out, but those, it was the IRS. I'm sorry, it was the IRS, a government agency, came out and said these trusts that were claiming they were 501c3 nonprofits. That's not true. They're not.
Oh, no.
And the NCAA has said that the trusts can't have anything to do with the school. Now, are schools finding creative workarounds for it? Yes, because as people always say, if you're not cheating, you're not trying.
Look, boosters are going to find ways to do this.
Yep.
They are going to find a way.
Let me tell you, the devil works hard, but college athletic boosters work so much harder. And I say that, somewhat lovingly, right?
Bro, I went to school in the SEC.
You know how it is. I mean, you know how it is. And so, the schools theoretically don't have anything to do with these trusts. I can think of one trust that's, well, I won't even go down that road necessarily, but there are examples of schools that say, we don't have anything to do with it, and, whatever. But
there are collectives, and then there are... Yeah. The funny thing to me, and I think the part where I find, the greatest incompatibility is you can't go down a road where you say we can't possibly pay them. They're amateurs. But, if you put their workload, just put it in a visual schedule, and you're like, oh. Mm-hmm. Oh, okay. Yeah. Okay. I'll put it like this. Until a few weeks ago, I was working for Paramount, CBS. And if I wanted to do anything, because my job quite literally required the use of my name, image, and likeness, if I wanted to do anything else with that, obviously your terms of employment with an entity like that, you grant them a license. In a lot of cases, it's an exclusive license, right? Yeah. In that way, they can direct some of what you do on the outside. Difference is they actually paid me, right? Like, if you're in this place, like the part that really kind of trips me out is like, the NIL out of control. Like, well, you know how to solve that? You know how to stop that? Pay them yourself. Mm-hmm. Then you can get in the way and decide there's a cap on how much these kids can get. There is, limits to what it is that they can endorse, limits to what it is they can do. Like, and I think, again, to your point, there's so much bad faith argument in this because the messaging got so mixed and muddied. And at some point, incompetence and malice sort of look like the same thing.
Yeah, well, and we, as a college athletic society, there's always been they're student athletes. They put such an emphasis on the word student is in their name. And we've been, fans have been bludgeoned over the head with that for years. So I think it's this idea that, we're paying students to play football or play basketball. Like, people are uncomfortable with that premise because we need to change the discussion because they are athletes who also happen to be students. They're not. Right. It's not like
I went to school with a dude, open secret. Mm-hmm. This was never substantiated in a way that you could find this written down anywhere. But open secret, dude could not read at a college level. Dude could barely read at an elementary school level.
Yeah,
out there playing the sport they were playing.
Yeah, let me tell you, I know that academics are important, right? I'm not saying they're not. As someone who finished college with a 3.9 GPA, humble brag,
I see.
Listen, academics are very important. I get it. But you're lying to yourself and to other people if you say that they are bringing certain athletes in to be student athletes. They're bringing them in because they give them the best chance to win on whatever field they're playing on and compete for national championships. And they are going to class on the side. But their main job is to be the best football player that they can possibly be and keep in the weight room and on the practice field, and also, find a way to stay eligible in the classroom so they can stay on the field and in the weight room and on the practice field. So that's the thing, is that we have to start looking at the conversation a different way, I think.
Or just be honest about it.
It. Yeah.
You just got to be honest about it, man. And at that point, that does require a complete overhaul of that entire structure, which ain't nobody trying to do that.
Yeah, like Alabama University Athletics, right, for example. Yeah, they're a part of Alabama University, but in name only. These departments are essentially operate autonomously, separate from the university. Now, are there checks and balances? They have the boards of regents and things like that, yes. But I promise you, if Nicholas Saban walks into the board of regents and says, I want this, they're going to give it to him. Why? Because he brings in so much revenue to the university.
Yep.
Right? And so it's very weird. The whole conversation around name, image, and likeness is very, I guess what you said, that there has been some intentionally misleading dialogue around it. And it's just, I go back to, I'm just the guy that gets paid to talk about it on TV on a play-by-play standpoint. I don't have all the solutions. Now, am I aware enough to point out the problems? Yeah, I think unless you just put your head in the sand and don't want to see the problems, I think anybody can point them out. But I don't necessarily have the solutions to it per se that could make it all work properly. But, I don't think name, image, and likeness is a bad thing by any means. Allowing players, again, I go back to, if you're not going to pay the players as an institution yourself, allowing them to then independently make money off of themselves is never a bad thing.
Not at all. All right, so as we wrap this up, the title of this podcast is Challenge the Norm. Mm-hmm. So what's challenging you right now?
I think taking the next step in my broadcasting career, and it's not necessarily a challenge that I'm struggling to break through. It's more just finding creative ways to do it. I mean, I've called in my life, I've broadcast 13 different sports. I mean, I've done swim meets, track and field, tennis. I mean, I joke with people, I can't even swim. right? And I've called a conference's swim and dive championships in a third-party location.
Yeah.
And so, it's just finding new ways to stay fresh. Motivation's never been an issue for me. I love this career. I want to succeed at play-by-play more than I want to breathe, frankly. I mean, there's nothing. Some people aspire to, write a book. Some people aspire to have a family. My aspiration is play-by-play. I could do a broadcast every single day of my life. And so trying to keep myself focused on the task at hand and not, comparison is the thief of joy, right? Mm-hmm. When I see other people my age or maybe a little younger than me, and I'm like, man, they're getting to do that. Why can't I do that? And it's important to remember for all, you broadcasters and play-by-play, people out there, it's important to remember that no two people take the same path in this career field to get to where they are.
That's true.
It's so true. And that was honestly, I walked away from my job in collegiate athletics because I was a play-by-play guy for a collegiate athletic department. I would say that was probably, what I felt like was my biggest failure in that job was remembering that no two people take the same path. The tenure in collegiate athletics was for me was personally marred with just feelings of inadequacy. Like, oh wow, I'm on year 5 here, and someone else spent a year and a half at no-name state university, and now they're here. And it's important to remember that that's great for them, and by no means was I rooting against them by thinking that. It was more I put in so much work, and I work so hard. When is it going to be my turn to do that? And then, here we are. Sometimes it does take. You do have to gamble on yourself a little bit. It is, was it uncomfortable leaving in October and not landing a full-time job until April? Yeah. Was it tough having to get in the car and put my dog in the back seat with me and drive all across God's creation for freelance gigs? And I was fortunate. I'm one of the lucky ones. You know this from you and I keeping in touch. My November to basically early April, I was doing a broadcast every week or every other week. Mm-hmm. There are some freelance play-by-play guys that go months without getting gigs. I mean, I was fortunate to be going to Charlottesville to do stuff and Norfolk to do stuff and Illinois and Missouri and Arkansas and all these places in between to get to go do things. So, but I would say that's still, I struggle with it still to this day of remembering, hey, focus on the task at hand. Don't focus on what someone else is doing. Focus on ways to improve my own craft. How can I get better? Not why am I not doing what, XYZ broadcaster is doing. And so I think that's a way to challenge myself, challenge the norm, so to speak. And so that would be my advice. Anybody that's listening to this is, just remember that, comparison's the thief of joy. Don't compare yourself to other broadcasters, and that no two people in this career take the exact same path to get to where they are today.
You might want to write that down somewhere. Write that book. Preach that to somebody. Now I'll flip the question. What are you challenging as you look at the world around you?
That's a good question. I think, I do know how I'm challenging. So, I'm a sports guy, right? I've always been a sports guy. I've worked in sports my entire life. I think the way I'm challenging the norm is, I think there's the idea that, maybe you do one thing for so long, you almost get pigeonholed into it, right? Oh, he's a sports guy. Well, I work a news job. That's my day job, right? I report and anchor the news on a radio station across the state. It's like 146 stations it goes to. And so I guess maybe that's a cop-out, but it's that's my way of challenging the norm, is I'm showing that, hey, I am versatile. I can do all of these things. I'm not just a play-by-play broadcaster. I'm a news anchor, reporter. I write. I do photography. I do videography. So I guess that's my way of challenging the norm, is not just being Jake, the play-by-play guy, but I am Jake, who does play-by-play, but I'm also versatile in many other ways.
I like that. I like that a lot, Jake. That is Jake Griffith. He works for Minnesota News Network. Check him out there. Check him out with Minnesota Aurora. I assume he'll be back next season. We'll just go ahead and claim it.
I'm speaking into existence, right? Manifesting.
Yes.
I mean, if it means anything, I tweeted about the season came to an end. It was a little late because I'm not super active on social media. But some of the team employees, the CEO, both said, we're glad to have you. Not, we were glad to have you. So if you want to read a little too much into the things there, maybe that means that, hey, I will be back. So
perfect.
Fingers crossed, but, go Aurora. Really looking forward to what the fall holds, and hopefully it's big things in the future.
Yeah, you got your winter coat yet?
My parents keep telling me, hey, we need to get you a new winter coat. Now, in fairness, they live in a part of Canada where the steam freezes on the smokestacks. Uh-huh. It gets so cold in the winter, and they have sent me winter coats before, so I think the coats from that probably will hold up in the winter. But I'll tell you, I was a hockey player growing up. I love hockey. In fact,
you good.
Oh yeah. In fact, my hockey bag is in the storage locker in the basement of my apartment complex. I am really looking forward to skating on a frozen pond. So if you're my mom listening to this, I'll make sure it's thick ice and I'm not gonna fall in because my mom is.
They do pond hockey tournaments here.
Oh yeah.
You know that.
My dad actually played when I was in high school, my dad actually played in a pond hockey tournament in Whitmore Lake, Michigan. Mm-hmm. Labatt's Blue pond hockey tournament.
There you go.
I wanted to go, but I was too young. I was like 14, and you had to be drinking age to play in the pond hockey tournament sponsored by alcohol.
Don't call them beer leagues for nothing.
Yeah, but I'm really looking forward. I know that sounds crazy that I'm probably looking forward to the winter, but I'm looking forward to it.
You'll fit right into Minnesota.
Yeah.
All right. I love it. That's our show, man. I know it's been a long one, hour and a half.
Wow.
A little over an hour and a half.
Wow.
Longer than I would typically plan for.
Who would have thought the play-by-play guy could talk for an hour?
Yeah, shocker. Right.
Right.
All right, thanks for joining us, y'all. Like, subscribe, all that stuff, rate, review, everything else, Still experimental, still figuring stuff out, but as we go, bring you all on this little ride with us. Thanks for listening. Take it easy. We'll talk to you in a few days.